Well, thank you all for coming. I'm Morris Foster. I'm a lineal descendant of Edgar Lee Hewett as president of the School for Advanced Research. And welcome to our second lecture in our semester-long exhumation of Edgar Lee Hewett. I feel like at the end of this we should all visit his remains at the Art Museum on the wall in the courtyard. His ashes are behind his plaque. So if you didn't know that, go touch the plaque. We are very pleased to be co-sponsoring this with the New Mexico History Museum. We think this is one among many future collaborations with the History Museum, and we're very pleased with that. This is something that, of course, we share because, as you may know, as we talked about last time, and I'm sure we'll touch on again today, Edgar Lee was both the original director of the School of American Archaeology, which became the School of American Research, which became the School of Advanced Research, and the original director of the New Mexico History Museum, which at one time I think Bruce incorporated the Art Museum, right? So, yeah, he was many things to many people, and we'll hear more about that today. But I want to introduce to you first our director of all things Hewett, Dr. Bruce Bernstein, who will talk about the program and introduce it. Bruce.
Well, thanks everyone for coming tonight. We really are today, as it afternoon still, for a nice summer day here in Santa Fe, unfortunately. And thank you everybody who's online. We really appreciate you sitting in your easy chair and drinking that beer. Save us one, we'll be over after the talk. This is the second of 4 lectures. We have another in about a month's time by Joseph Woody Aguilar, who will talk about the effects of Edgar Lee Hewett on the Pueblo of San Ildefonso, where he's from. And the last one is me. I don't know if I'll have anything left to say about Hewett, but I hope that I will. And as Morris suggested, he is the founder and first director of the Museums of New Mexico and the School for Advanced Research. And now the Rethinking Hewett series celebrates the digitization of Hewett's papers. And that was done by Hannah Abelbeck, who's here someplace, who's going to speak tonight. Thank you, Hannah. And Heather McClure, who's also here. Thank you, Heather. She's also going to speak a little bit, a magnificent project. When I began to work with Hewett's papers about 30 years ago, I was working on a dissertation and other things. They were just in a drawer in the original folders, let's just suggest, and they were a mess. So it's so nice to have them digitized and preserved in the right way. And then also we have the new Deputy Director, Maria Sanchez Tucker here. Come on now, don't be shy. Thank you for coming tonight. Heather, Hannah and I worked on the idea for this series. We had talked for a while about the importance of bringing along Hewett's papers and calling attention to Hewett, and we thought it should take a fresh look. So besides these 4 lectures, the SAR, Morris and the SAR is sponsoring an advanced seminar at the very end of April, beginning of May, which we hope will turn into a book. That's the aspiration. And the book will be both for scholar and lay people both. We really want to make a book that people will read. So really, what's the deal with Hewett, right? What's going on here? Why are we even standing here? This was a guy long ago. He's in the rearview mirror, right? So why are we bothering with this guy? We've got to ask ourselves those questions, right? And so maybe I'm fascinated by someone who could make so many mistakes and miss so many great opportunities and still be revered in some way. I hope it's not a model for me, by the way. But do we really need to go over this old ground and discuss this guy from long ago? Maybe it's just an indulging of our academic ambitions. And so my quick review of Hewett tonight is going to be in 3 sections. Archaeology. I should have put that slide up here. This is the talk we're going to hear tonight, right? Hewett, Mythmaking and Cultural Conflict by Alicia Romero and Hannah Abelbeck. You can see they're all looking, he's got them mesmerized, they're all looking the same direction. And then, so I'm just going to have a quick review of Hewett. I'm going to talk about the 1900 to 1915 period, which is archaeology and artist. I'm then going to talk about the 1915 to 1926 period, which is about public festivals. That's more or less going to be fiestas tonight, although Indian market is involved in that in some ways, but we're just going to focus on fiestas and chautauquas tonight. And then 1926, I'm just going to talk about the bomb and leave it at that for a moment. So Hewett came west from Indiana to teach first at the Colorado Normal School, and then he moved on to the New Mexico Normal University, which is now Highlands in Las Vegas. And he taught at each place for a while. It's a little controversial whether he left voluntarily or he moved. And his wife, Cora, was very sickly. And fresh air of New Mexico, the altitude and fresh air from Greeley, he thought would help. They had a special wagon built. And in that wagon in the summertime, they camped all over the Pajarito Plateau. And as far as we can tell, that's the introduction. There's nothing in Hewett's background that suggests he's going to be interested in native people or their histories or what would become archaeology. There's no indication that he taught any courses like that, but they started camping around. And by 1898, he was meeting San Ildefonso people. He traveled around with two different people in that early period, Dieguito Roybal, who's a famous portrait of him in the Art Museum, and the other person is Antonio Dominguez Peña, or Guayama, who was cacique and governor of the Pueblo of San Ildefonso. And these men took him around. I'm sure he paid them in some ways, but that's what he did. He modeled his work on Bandelier's work, Adolf Bandelier, which is an interesting problem, because the main theory that Bandelier was looking for was, where did the Aztecs settle when they moved north? So a lot of people at that time, starting in the mid part of the 19th century, felt that when the Toltecs had been conquered by the Aztec, they just moved north. And the reason for that was these people living in the Pueblos could never have built these great structures. Somebody else had to have done this. It could not have been the Pueblos, who Hewett described as 9/10 returned to dirt. So first slide, whoops, I missed that. This is the first slide. So this is what Pajarito Plateau archaeology looks like in Hewett's time. So the first slide over here, this is waiting at the Otoe station. This is about 1912. They're waiting at the station. He's in the back there, second from the left. He's not the dashing cowboy, but the guy next to him in the ranger outfit. So that's one thing, that you had to get up that road. The road is not that different, honestly. And you'd come up from Buckman, is what would happen. You come up from Buckman, where all the city's water utilities are now, and you'd come up on the train, and you'd be left off at Otoe Bridge, which is still very much there. And then you'd haul all your stuff up, you'd pack it all up, and you'd spend the summer up there, 2 or 3 months up there. There were some people with cabins and so forth that they stayed at. And then the other thing is, when he brought people up, in the picture below that, he brought 20 San Ildefonso people up with him in those first years, and they did do some of the work. You can see that in the next picture over, this one here, that Julian Martinez has moved to the side so the 2 white guys can do the excavations, because they must have found something. That's the only way I can read that, I'm sorry. And then the one next to that, the left of that, is that they're doing an eagle dance to entertain the archaeologists while they're up there. And then this picture on the top, the one with the writing across the top, that's at Otoe in 1915. And to come to lunch, you had to bring your morning discovery. That was the rule. And then over here is Julian Martinez looking out over his brethren and just not so happy, if you ask me. So that's kind of what his archaeology looked like. Traditional archaeological historians characterize Hewett as a poor archaeologist, but a great politician, a great promoter. Basically, that's it. Hewett, we always talk about Hewett as someone who kicked aside things, people, so he could find the whole bowls. And if you look through his collection, that's very much what you find about him. Very different type of guy. He missed the boat in archaeology, and the boat he missed was that there is age difference in archaeology or stratigraphy, right? So he had that person on his early field schools, but he never listened to him later on. So by 1915, Hewett's archaeology is gone, and he spent the rest of his career justifying how he had known real, authentic Native people. And archaeologists working post-1915, 1920 never knew real people. So they didn't have the knowledge that he would have. And almost every publication following the bomb in 1926, that was kind of what it was like. Hewett also had a permanent legacy, and I think the permanent legacy is particularly important because we enjoy these things all the time. An old-style dirge, that's the Fiesta, public education in Chautauqua, that's the beginning of the end. He decided he wanted to do Chautauqua and public historical pageantry about 30 years after his ending elsewhere. Not good timing on his part, but he felt strongly about this, and he felt in the dirt of the Pajarito, they were digging up the ancestral memory of San Ildefonso. So out of the archaeology he was doing, which I assure you was human remains and pottery, he found the ceremonial cycle called House of the Sun. And that House of the Sun was what was performed at fiestas. Also, another thing, Hannah's going to talk about this a bit, but the bottom two pictures on the left side of the screen, this is my favorite float from 1921. There's Hewett on the far left side talking to a bleacher full of people about what's a float represents. It's about the progress of humans and civilization. It's a parade. And the first float in the parade is, just as it says, prehistory trade. That was the progress of people then. And on that float, standing over the drum, that's Maria Martinez. Her husband Julian's on that float. The Viking-looking guys on the side with the shields slung over their shoulders. One of those is Abutsede Alfonso Roybal. So it's a momentous time. And the other side are enduring legacies despite Hewett. So Hewett made a lot of people unhappy. And part of the unhappiness turned into these places, the Laboratory of Anthropology. When John D. Rockefeller came, he was told there were great things happening here. When he met Hewett, he kind of went back north to Mesa Verde to talk to Jesse Nussbaum, was kind of unhappy. Nussbaum said, go back and talk to Kenneth Chapman. And in the basement of the art museum was about 200 pots, 300 Pueblo pots. And the next morning, Chapman was squeezed between Mr. and Mrs. Rockefeller as they drove up in their Packard car up to San Ildefonso to meet Maria Martinez. And Rockefeller then gave them money, and they planned, and they built the Laboratory of Anthropology for the Indian Arts Fund. That's what it was built to do, was to show and study and make accessible that. And just as a word, the Laboratory of Anthropology also was the place here where they began to look at stratigraphy to understand the differences between different cultural or archaeological sites. That's where that happened. They started naming types of pottery and all those things. Or when you say first phase chief's blanket or second phase chief's blanket, Laboratory of Anthropology. That's where that all happened. And then also he built the art museum in 1917. It opened with a $50,000 gift from the state. He was able to raise that money thanks to Frank Springer. And then the Palace of the Governors, of course, and the remodel of it between 1909 and 1912. Again, 1909 being the founding of the museum, 3 years before statehood. You know, Santa Fe had 8,000 people in 1880, and by the time Hewett showed up, it had 6,000 people. And if you think about that, just when everything was everything was dirt roads, and so it was not particularly what maybe people would think a modern place. It was probably a more wonderful place in some ways, right? But it wasn't easy doing these things. And here's the bomb. This is it. 1926, he wraps up everything he thinks that he's going to do. All the good things about Chautauqua. It's been in the papers for 2 years that he needs to step away. He's just an old guy trying to do old things. His artist that he had brought, as he put it, my artist that I brought here, John Sloan and all Bauman and all these other people, turned against him. And Mary Austin in particular was really anti-Hewett. And he took all that energy and all his anger over this, and he built a dirt stadium above what's now Fort Marcy Park. Where the houses are, just above there, that's where they had a piece of land. They carved out this stadium. You can see that. You can see the sorts of performances they had there. It rained the entire 1926 Fiestas as well, by the way. But this was his idea to build this permanent Chautauqua site. This is what he showed Rockefeller as what he wanted Rockefeller to do. It's my pleasure to introduce Heather McClure, who's going to give you a little bit of library stuff and show you some of the great things that they've been finding. You're up. It's your turn.
So thank you, Bruce. So good afternoon. My name's Heather McClure. I'm a librarian and archivist at the Fray Angelico Chavez History Library at the New Mexico History Museum. And I was the manager of the Increasing Public Access to the Treasures of Edgar L. Hewett's American Southwest, the project that brought this amazing collection to the world and an inspiration for this series. A lot of the Hewett document collection is correspondence, and Hewett's preferred mode of work was overscheduled. He worked on multiple projects in multiple locations around the country and the world at the same time, and he would leave surrogates in place to handle the day-to-day work, necessitating copious correspondence. Or, as longtime Hewett collaborator Jesse Nussbaum described, he wanted things done fast, you do it, and then he would leave for the Near East, Athens, or Rome, and then casually take credit for your work. And it was exactly that sort of behavior that earned Hewett the nickname El Toro. Not to his face, obviously, and quite the opposite in the correspondence. And looking at all these letters, I noticed repeatedly letter salutations like, "My dear Mr. Hewett," and this was the most common misspelling, H-E-W-I-T-T. And which at first I interpreted as an overly polite form of address to someone with a lot of pull, like, "My dear Dr. Hewett." And then I started noticing that style all over the place, to and from a lot of different people and a lot of different letters. But it wasn't used in every letter, and the more you looked at these letters, the more you start to see differences in tone in the salutations. Either efficient and businesslike, "Dear Sir," "Dear Madam," "Dear Miss Dugan," or friendlier like, "My dear Mr. Parsons," "My dear Mr. Seaton," that's a letter to Ernest Thompson Seaton, "My dear Mr. Gates," "My dear Mr. Sloan," "Dear Hewett." Or friendliest, like "My dear Nussbaum" and "Dear Jess," as seen in these letters to Jesse Nussbaum. And this really jumped out at me because Hewett very much, I did not see a lot of letters where he addressed someone by their first name in a letter. And then you find the documents and letters which were probably written with gritted teeth. "My dear Dr. Hewett." So, Dr. James Sneed, our speaker from last month, sent me some notes he had taken from collections at the Harvard Archives. Whoops, getting ahead of myself. At the Harvard Archives from correspondence by Dr. Alfred Tozer, the Mesoamerican linguist and archaeologist from 1908, where Tozer says, "I never saw a man like Hewett for work. It certainly is a good thing, for we make the dirt fly." But by 1910, Tozer was sending different sentiments, and this is in a letter that Dr. Curtis Hinsley found in the Peabody Museum archive from Tozer to Mr. Gardner Lane in Boston. "I consider Mr. Hewett, first of all, a politician. He has shown ability in obtaining money for archaeological work and in influencing people to see his side of any case he wishes to present. His power over a certain class of men, and especially over women, is very great indeed." Well, Dr. Tozer, about the politician comment, I agree with you 150%. About the pulling in women, I don't know, I never met the guy. But Dr. Tozer, you hit the nail on the head. And this is the kind of thing that probably really grated on Tozer. This is a New York Times story from January 21st, 1912, on Hewett's work in Quirigua, Guatemala, where he spent 3 seasons. And this guy in the middle there, this is the guy that Tozer thinks makes women swoon and hand over their pocketbooks. And this is from the Hewett collection in a wonderfully named folder called Dorman Cutting Tozer Fiasco, 1913 to 1914. And this was over battling over director and leadership of the School of SAR at that point. And Dr. Tozer writes to Harry Dorman, head of the Santa Fe Chamber of Commerce, "I rejoice that Santa Fe has at last risen to the occasion and has placed Hewett where he belongs. His method of work serves as a laughingstock for a great many of us. I have been trying to explain Hewett for the last 8 years. Again, I say I am glad that Santa Fe is learning what manner of man he is." Yes, I know. But let me just say, this was not just a letter in the collection. This got smeared all over the front page of the Santa Fe New Mexican. I'm sure you all noticed, calls Hewett a laughingstock. And this was from October 16th, 1913. And it goes into a lot about the letter that I just read a few sections of. Tozer's complaint did not work because Hewett remained the director of SAR and the Museum of New Mexico until his death in 1946. But this was startling to me because normally these snippy sort of letters are not in someone's collection. They are like they show up in other collections like side conversations happening at the same time, not in the collection of the person who is the subject of the snippy letter. And I am so glad we can talk more today about this colossally fascinating pain in the neck, Edgar Hewett, and the world in which he lived and worked. And I've spent most of my time at these first 2 lectures talking about what you can see in this collection. And when I see you at the next lecture in this series on Tuesday, March 24th, I'll be talking about what you cannot see in this collection. Thank you. Oh, back to you, my dear Dr. Bernstein.
Well, thank you for supporting all the things I said that seemed out of hand, huh? That's the bomb. 26, everything caught up with him. That's the deal, that he was not the first choice of the Eastern establishment to be the head of the School of American Archaeology. They didn't want Hewett, who was untrained. They did not want it in some dirty city like Santa Fe. So they started from there, and Tozer is a Harvard man, and I'm sorry for anyone at Harvard, but it's not a smear against Harvard, it's just how Tozer conducted himself. Anyways, there's many of those letters, and I loved the narration. Thank you very much, Heather, for putting life in those letters. Let's see. So now we're going to come to the reason you're really here, not to listen to me, but we're going to hear about Edgar Lee Hewett, Mythmaking and Cultural Conflict by Alicia Romero and Hannah Abelbeck. Hannah is a curator of photographs and archival collections at the New Mexico History Museum. She has worked in archives at the History Museum since 2013, with previous roles as digitization specialist and photo archivist. Hannah's training in literature, in art history and American studies, with experience in publishing PR and academic archives. In addition to overseeing archival collections, she has also curated History Museum's exhibit, Zozobra, A Fire That Never Goes Out. Her graduate degree is from Penn State, where she held a university fellowship. She's an advocate, and she is the advocate for robust public humanities engagement and making history collections more accessible to the public. And I think I cut off, there. And Alicia Romero, who's here, and she's going to speak first tonight, is the head curator and curator of history at the Albuquerque Museum. Previously, the head curator at the Palace of the Governor's History Museum here in Santa Fe. And she's done a number of wonderful exhibitions here, and then also was very much involved in the renovation of the Palace building. So Alicia, you're first. Thank you very much. We will have time for questions when they both finish, so don't interrupt her. Don't get her pissed off. Did I say that out loud? Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for that great introduction. Muy buenas tardes, yo soy Alicia Romero, as was stated, curator at the Albuquerque Museum. It's not an often invitation I get to join colleagues in Santa Fe, but talking with Hannah and Heather at doing a presentation on Hewett, my old friend, after working many years at the Palace of the Governors, I was happy to revisit some of that research that I did a long time ago. Now in Albuquerque, yes, he had influence there, certainly with the UNM Department of Anthropology, but I have less to do with him over there than I did here in Santa Fe. Okay. So my talk, Edgar Lee Hewett as cultural broker, Palace of the Governors, Santa Fe Fiesta, and Indian Detours. I'm already going to omit part of this presentation just because conferring with my colleague Hannah, I know she's going to talk a little bit more about the Indian Detour, so I will let her do that and save most of my words for the other two things. Okay, so let me go back. This presentation focuses on the role and influence of Dr. Hewett on significant cultural institutions. While scholars have explored Hewett's relationships and engagement with indigenous peoples, to put it lightly, my research questions explore the role of Nuevo Mexicanos in Hewett's cultural preservation initiatives. In short, I ask, to what degree did Edgar Lee Hewett determine a perspective of Nuevo Mexicanos that has proven nearly inescapable more than a century after Hewett first began working in the Palace of the Governors? So, I know that other scholars have tackled some of these questions, but they just keep coming up. I think as somebody who continues to live this legacy, what does it mean for us here in Santa Fe? What does it mean for us here in New Mexico? Okay, many of us are familiar with the founding of the School of American Archaeology in 1907, known now as the School of Advanced Research, and the Museum of New Mexico in 1909, with offices in the Palace of the Governors, or the Old Palace. So what did I put here? 1909 to 1913, 1909 to 1912. This is what the palace looked like way back when, during the era of Governor Bradford Prince, Territorial Governor Bradford Prince. Of course, it looks very different, and this was something that Dr. Hewett did not appreciate when he came on the scene, right? This is a very common view. Territorial, the gingerbread style. I'm not an architectural historian, but you can plainly see what I see. Here, of course, we have Dr. Hewett in his office here on your left with his associate friend, all things Palace of the Governors, Jesse Nussbaum. I had a great time getting to know this history of the Palace of the Governors as I worked for a few years with archaeologists Dee Dee Snow and Steve Post on the joint exhibit we worked on, Palestine and Unseen, that occupies the western part of the Palace of the Governors. Now, when I started working at the New Mexico History Museum, that was 2018, the palace was just being emptied out. I'm diverging a little bit from what I was originally talking about, but that was my first real exposure to some of this deeper history of the palace from the perspective of museum people, not knowing that I was going to have a long line, or I'm following in the footsteps of a long line of museum people to work in the palace, to make it their own, to manipulate it to serve the story that they felt needed to be told. I hadn't visited the palace since I was in third grade before then, so I am born and raised in Albuquerque, and had known that history a little bit from the perspective of a kid. So throughout their work together, over the years, Nussbaum worked on archaeological digs in Mexico and Central America, digs in the Southwest, worked at Mesa Verde, taught at the Normal School in Vegas, was a photographer, and for the purposes here, supervised the construction at the Palace of the Governors. Nussbaum worked with Sylvanus Morley and Kenneth Chapman to complete the effort. One of the great things about the New Mexico History Museum as the first real museum here, we have so many of their collections here that we exhibited a few years ago in our exhibition that talked about the history of the Museum of New Mexico collections. So here's some of Nussbaum's efforts to take that territorial old palace and make it into the modern reflection of an old Spanish colonial pueblo, right? So let's add in a portal, let's make it constructed kind of the idea of what we think it would have looked like. We know that there weren't cameras back then, following some sort of figurative maps and drawings, and whatever was described in the colonial documents about what the palace may have looked like. This was something that Nussbaum and certainly Hewett took to heart and made their own artistic license in some decisions. Cutting through walls, right, making that long hallway, that long sight line that you see from the east to the west. As a staff member there, I think it was burned into all of our brains, the numbers of each room that was assigned to them. Some of my colleagues are shaking their head no, but yes. Rooms 13, 12, right, some of those 15. This is what the palace, of course, looked like by the 1920s. This is the palace that you all see today. Maybe not the Model T or the Model A in front of it, but this is what we see from this, the same vantage point, to this, right? So this is not anything new. But I wanted to read a little bit from a quote from Governor Mills as he was reflecting on the 1911 renovations that is speculated that Hewett wrote himself. The work of repair has consisted in the removal of modern woodwork from the doors, windows, and fireplaces, and the restoration of those interesting architectural features to their original form as nearly as can be determined, and that is my emphasis, as can be determined. The modern plastering and papering of the walls have been replaced by cement work of the most durable character, simulating as nearly as possible the original finish of the rooms. It will be the function of this museum to preserve all that is best in New Mexico's historic past, and especially it is the intention to preserve the old palace of the governors as a monument to the Spanish founders of the civilization of the Southwest. Right, and so when I was working as a staff member there at the museum, we were looking at the period of significance, right? Kind of winding back the clock, eliminating some of those exhibitions of the 1970. The Prince Room that I know many people were very, very fond of. The Chapel Room, that was always a favorite of many folks. Peeling back those layers that were instituted in the 1970s to take it back to this period of significance that included the Hewett interpretation of the Palace of the Governors. But as it stood, a monument to Spanish colonization. I like this photo. This is 9A. As I mentioned, all these room numbers have been burned into many of our brains. This is the former entrance. I think it's still the former entrance. This was how we entered the Palace of the Governors from Palace Avenue. Those doors, I think, have remained closed, save for ceremonial entrances. But this is what the room looked like in about 1920. Those three murals are by Swiss painter Karl Lotav, who also did the murals of the Puye Room. I believe it's at room 8, room 7. Somebody can correct me. These are three murals. As I was looking at these, and they're not on view anymore in the museum, these are in the collections, but these are the three scenes. This is the first of what I think of first evidence of that tricultural harmony depicted in a public space. So one of the murals is depicting the early indigenous history, right? A Native American who is kind of kneeling at the base of the Santa Fe River. The next mural is depicting the entrada, the de Vargas entrada of 1692, 1693, right? The bloodless reconquest. The third mural depicts a wagon train, right? So the arrival of the Americans to Santa Fe, beginning with the opening of the Santa Fe Trail in 1821. So this, as I look at it from my own perspective, right? If I was entering in this room, if I was entering in from Palace Avenue, I was walking through time, and I'm being confronted by the story of New Mexico, the history of New Mexico, as put plainly in front of me visually, right? Beautiful visual representations of what Lotav and perhaps Hewett wanted people to understand and wanted people to learn. All these are just inferences, right? But we see this tricultural myth being played out over and over again in other public spaces and things that we continue to deal with to this very day. So over 100 years later, we're still living the legacy of some of these early decisions made by Hewett and Friends. Maybe I should have titled it Hewett and Friends, but because he certainly wasn't acting alone by any means. Let me see. And I know that these were before the dawn of the Mexican muralist moment, but I was trying to make some kind of connections in my mind of murals as public education, right? As a form of instructing the masses on a story that they may not know very well or something that they may not hear in the public education scenario. This, of course, is not that, but thinking about the role that murals play in our public spaces, especially when they're supposed to reflect some sort of historical moment. Santa Fe Fiesta, the most wonderful topic of all. No. A perennial favorite, the Santa Fe Fiesta. So this next series of slides really attempts, and I emphasize attempts, to tease out some of the years in which Dr. Hewett was actively involved in the fiesta. I know Hannah will talk about at least one of these same slides in her presentation, but my questions are regarding the development of the modern Santa Fe Fiesta, the invention of the entrada pageant, and the subsequent and perpetual conflict between indigenous and Nuevo Mexicano people that seem to hit a high note every September, right? The fiesta we know today has, to a large extent, changed significantly from how it was celebrated 100 years ago and even earlier. Many of us are aware that the fiesta, as it was practiced prior to the 19th century, and to the extent that it was celebrated on a regular basis, was largely a religious ceremony, right? A feast day. Without the organization of popular programs that stepped outside of the Catholic Church. While Dr. Hewett did not restart the fiestas on his own merit, he, as director of now SAR and the Museum of New Mexico, took over beginning in 1919 and shifted focus to a more historical reflection of the 1692-1693 Reconquista. In looking through the digitized Hewett collection at the New Mexico History Museum, I was interested to see how the fiesta had evolved. While many of us now think of the entrada and zozobra, well, perhaps also the pet and the historical parade, as the true markers of fiesta, here we see that in 1919 and throughout Hewett's leadership, there was an inclusion of American territorial history as well. We know that Dr. Hewett led tours through northern New Mexico, through southern Colorado, and back down through Chaco Canyon with stops throughout the Navajo Nation, Zuni, Acoma, Laguna, and Isleta Pueblos. He made a specific stop, this is what this photograph references, during one such tour to visit Kit Carson's grave. Carson's story, as well as that of the American takeover of New Mexico, was part of the Fiesta program. So I'll turn it back to this one. What is this? From 1919. So from 1919 through the early 1920s, again under Dr. Hewett's leadership, the 1922 Fiesta consisted of 4 days of celebration. The first was dedicated to indigenous peoples, the second focused on de Vargas, the third on Spanish Americans, and the fourth was called the Santa Fe Trail Day. Here they celebrated with a Star-Spangled Banner and went through the various periods of American history under the theme of, quote, the commerce of the prairies, end quote. French traders, the French trader period from 1750 to 1810, early exploratory endeavors, the Santa Fe Trail with Becknell, Gregg, Carson, Kearney, Governor Manuel Armijo, and Charles Bent was explored. Santa Fe Trail Day also went on to celebrate the 1850-1860 period with the U.S. Corps of Engineers and merchants making their way into Santa Fe. The Fiesta pageantry related to this history culminates with the railroad period from 1860 to 1880, as it was described, and finally, the celebration of the modern city of Santa Fe and the rise of automobile travel from 1880 to 1921. I was looking for an actual Route 66 connection because everything is Route 66 right now. So I'll spare you. I didn't find it, so we're focusing on the fiestas today. But 1926 is certainly a bombshell year for many reasons. Okay. Again, I know Hannah will talk more about this photo and the artist's responses to Hewett, but for my purposes, I wanted to show one Nuevo Mexicano who played a consistent role in the fiesta, especially when it came to the entrada, although it was not called the entrada back then, right? There was just multiple forms of pageantry, both in the Indigenous Peoples Day, in the de Vargas Day, in the Spanish American Day, and in the Santa Fe Trail Day pageantry. And the celebration of de Vargas and the Spanish American days. So Colonel Jose Sena was an active member of society that regularly participated in civic events and was very engaged with the church. He was from the prominent Sena family for whom Sena Plaza on Palace Avenue is named. His father, Jose Sena Sr., was a former mayor of Santa Fe, and Jr. was either married into or had blood relations that tied him to many politically powerful families throughout Santa Fe and northern New Mexico. I'm still exploring the connections Hewett had with local Nuevo Mexicanos, such as Sena and the Espinosa family, who also contributed to the fiesta. Who were the other folks, the gente decente, that Hewett engaged with? Were there close friends or collaborators like Maria and Julian Martinez, who were from regular Nuevo Mexicano families? When Sena died in 1951, and Sena, of course, is all the way to your right, his obituary remarked that Colonel Sena was the scion of old Spanish stock, identified with the beginning of civilization. Indeed, then, he was a perfect partner to work with Hewett as part of the fiesta. So here Colonel Sena is standing next to Dr. Hewett, looking like a very galán Spanish caballero, right? In all his Spanish fiesta costume. And people were encouraged to dress in their finest fiesta outfits, whatever that meant for them. Whatever that meant for them in the 1920s certainly did not mean the same thing by the 1960s. I wish we have photos of those early fiesta dresses, but unfortunately neither Hewett nor Sena is wearing one of them. But over the years, Colonel Sena was charged with either taking a lead acting role or directing the De Vargas pageant, and what we now call the Entrada, but hadn't been called at the time. So on De Vargas Day, during the Hewett years, the Reconquest pageant took center stage and had paid participation from a number of indigenous performers. Apart from this, the, quote, Spanish element included music from the troubadours, Spanish dancing with castanets, so like actual Spanish dancing maybe, and even a quote, Spanish serape, and that's how it was written. Serape dance, led by Mrs. Edgar Knight. Colonel Sena played the role of De Vargas a few times, but was always played a key character in the overall drama for as long as he had participated. Although not a word of English was spoken in Santa Fe in 1692, 1693, the pageant version of the Entrada was held entirely in English, with Spanish only being used during song. On day 3, Spanish American Day was really the celebration of Mexican independence. Again, this was in that 1922, those early years of Santa Fe Fiestas. Dances like the matachines made some appearances, and other, quote, Mexican dances were included. So probably the ill-named Mexican hat dance, right? The jarabe tapatío was included. Hannah directed me to an incredible passage in El Palacio, the October 15th, 1926 issue of El Palacio, when a Mrs. Lydia Trowbridge, a self-described outsider, remarked about the fiesta that ceremonies alone cannot interpret life. And interpretation is the essence of the fiesta. But indigenous people, my insertion, are not the only race concerned in this historical pageant. There are the Spanish, still proud of their lineage, still boasting, quote, the blood of the conquerors, end quote. There are the Mexicans, not quite yet weaned from old Mexico. These must have increasing representations in a fiesta that means or should mean far more to them than any Americano. Spanish songs, Spanish dances, and the drama of an intensely dramatic people must be made to play their part in the fiesta program. But unless this is to be merely a fiesta for, quote, home folks, the performers must submit to training. There must be pride in fine workmanship. Home folks, and that's, she puts that in quotes, may applaud a crude performance, but not the world. The love of things Spanish seems to have fallen asleep in Santa Fe. Love of the fine Spanish things, not of the tawdry. The tawdry will live anywhere, anytime. In Southern California, we hear there's a Spanish Renaissance, right? We're thinking of Ramona, that book Ramona. There will be in Santa Fe someday a Spanish Renaissance. Then those of Spanish blood will be glad to give the best that is in them to the adequate presentation of the poetry and romance of Spanish American things. just want to talk really quickly again about some of the Spanish that was used, right? The Spanish, when it was in the Spanish part of this presentation, when it was in Spanish, not Spanish presented in English. Musical selections, again, were in Spanish. I came across a pamphlet entitled Spanish Songs of the Santa Fe Fiesta in the Hewett collection. Here are the lyrics to longtime favorites such as Cielito Lindo, I won't ask you all to burst into song, Las Golondrinas, and even La Cucaracha were included. I found it interesting that Adelita, a song called Adelita, a Mexican revolutionary song, was included among the program of Spanish songs to be sung during the fiesta. Why would songs popularized during the Mexican Revolution be included during this less than Mexican event, right? We know that the Mexican Revolution had just ended technically, right? It was fought between 1910 to 1920 and experienced an incredible reconstruction period after that post-revolutionary period. But for all intents and purposes, we can say that it ended in 1920 with the election of President Álvaro Obregón. That civil war, that 10-year-long civil war, wreaked havoc, and out of it came incredible cultural production and renaissance, right? Muralist movement, songs, in the 1940s and 50s, films that really emphasize a national character. And one of these songs is Adelita, about a soldadera, a woman soldier. She's also characterized as a camp follower, somebody who followed Mexican revolutionary troops and assisted these men when and where she could. So Adelita, we're singing Adelita on the plaza during fiestas, or maybe at the back of the Palace of the Governors. There was another song that was included. It's called La Firolera. Does anybody know that song? La Firolera. YouTube is amazing. The internet is amazing. So I found La Firolera.
Mi marido está en la cama y yo en la cabecera con el rosario en la mano pidiéndole a Dios que se muera. Firoliroli, firoliroli, firolirolera, firoliroli, ven acá, firolirolera, ven aquí, firoliroli.
I won't make you listen to the whole song because I also think I'm approaching my end. But I thought this was an interesting song to include here. It reminded me of a song that my grandma used to sing to me, just that end part, that da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da. If any of you know the music of Pedro Infante, a really great singer of Mexico during those golden years, 1950s and 60s, or 40s and 50s. He had a song called El Piojo y la Pulga, and it kind of went along the same way. But this song, she's talking about an episode of domestic violence. I could characterize it just very plainly. It's very nicely put. A woman is praying to God that he takes her sick husband. And finally he dies. And she thanks God for taking him away and remarks that now he's in hell getting the beating from the devil that she had received from him. So, you know, when I think of Dr. Hewett, when I think of his legacy that he left at the Palace of the Governors and the Santa Fe Fiestas, you know, I think about the entrada, I think about how much friction, not just that one particular pageant, right, our long history of colonialism and colonization here in New Mexico as personified maybe, as acted out in the entrada. This was the vision of Hewett and company, right, to make this scene happen, acted out in dramatic fashion where that wasn't the case for many hundreds of years prior, when and where it was ever celebrated. So again, this presentation is mostly just some of the questions that I'm asking about. Yes, we know about Hewett and his relationship with many indigenous communities, his lackluster performance as an archaeologist or anthropologist, or the many things that he did wrong and maybe that he did right, but some of the things that I have found not as relevant or not as prominent in the scholarship is his relationship and impact on Nuevo Mexicanos, right? And I call them Nuevo Mexicanos. I don't say Spanish or Spanish American. I say Nuevo Mexicano is multi-generational Spanish-speaking person from New Mexico, right? Are we to live with this long legacy of his interpretation of colonization without complicating it further? Can we retake our Mexican identity and our Mexican history and be proud of that? Or are we always going to approach the Palace of the Governors as a monument to Spanish civilization? And I would argue against that.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. I'm really excited to talk about this with you. My topic is a little lighter, and I'm going to talk about what Bruce called the bomb. And no, this isn't really new, but I feel like there's some new visual sources that we've uncovered in the last few years, and I also think it hasn't really been told as a story how Hewett was roasted. So 1926, as we mentioned, was a watershed year for Hewett's relationship with Santa Fe. And a big rift opened up between the Museum of New Mexico director Hewett and a subset of Santa Fe people. And while initially Hewett and all of these members of Santa Fe had seen themselves as allies with mutual interests, significant differences in the 20s spilled over into direct contestation over culture. So this quote, in 1926, Mary Austin wrote to Ina Sizer Cassidy, "The fiesta this year was simply ghastly. What everyone is saying now is that before Santa Fe can hope to recover from it, there will have to be a hanging," meaning, of course, our friend at the museum. That's Hewett. So I believe the 1926 Pasatiempo Parade, which I'm going to talk about for most of my presentation, and we'll probably go over 5, so stick around if you're being entertained, was intended as Hewett's metaphorical hanging. And the way that protests played out changed Santa Fe culture for the long run. Issues at the center of the controversy aren't settled now, and are part of the contested public space, public culture, and public landscape in Santa Fe today. So Alicia was talking about this moment of Hewett's fiestas, and it was a big deal. People were enamored of the idea of celebrating Santa Fe's culture with big public celebrations, but not everyone was happy, right? As Bruce mentioned, this came too late for it to be the best thing around. And not everyone was happy. I think one of the biggest things that was happening is that in the 20s, events grew increasingly ticketed. The presumed audience was intended to be larger and drawn from farther outside of Santa Fe, and the production costs and values also were skyrocketing. Gustav Baumann described a bandstand built up into the trees of the plaza facing the governor's palace with a high fence and a ticket booth, and at the ends kept out the very people with the most right to be there. Witterbinner remembered the fiestas were bent heavily to the archaeological and ethnological side. Lectures happening, a stress on Indian dances given in the patio for entrance fees, and most Santa Feans wandering dismally in the plaza with very little to see or do. Other events continued to be painfully didactic, and although members of the community tried to point it out, Binner wrote, "Deaf ears were turned to us by Dr. Hewett and others in control." Gustav Baumann remembered and commemorated the artist's intervention in this painting that's now in the History Museum collections that depicts what they'd called El Pasatiempo de la Gente. The parade started with an upbeat funeral march. My presentation will focus on visual sources for the events. And so I'm just going to argue that recent controversies in Santa Fe have erupted over public celebrations, especially around fiestas, because of this unsettled history, and as well as over public memorialization generally. But at stake now and at stake then were a series of questions that remain contested. How do you present history? How should you honor culture? How should you involve community? What makes a place special? And who decides? There were hundreds of participants in the Pasatiempo parades and many gags and bits. Lots of members of the community contributed efforts and talents to this parade, protest, Pasatiempo. And just as an example, here's an announcement Bauman made. That was in the Art Museum's Bauman exhibit. So one gag, that's just an example, that was of the time was the Fred Harvey Company's Indian Detours, which Alicia didn't talk about, but could have. The detours would jumpstart a transition from the railroad era to the automobile era, and it ferried tourists directly to archaeological sites and to Pueblo communities and explained New Mexico to those tourists. The project kind of seems like a commercial application of the museum's endeavors. In A Peculiar Alchemy, Nancy Owen Lewis observed that while Dana Johnson and the New Mexican opposed the Cultural Center project, which I'll get to soon, the newspaper supported Indian detours, writing that detours, quote, probably had a greater impact on the future of Santa Fe and the entire southwestern area than that Club Woodman's colony would ever have brought. Hewett and the museum, as in this picture, also went out of their way to support detours, including by letting Hunter Clarkson use St. Francis Auditorium. In the parade, and I've excerpted the bit in the painting for you to compare, John Sloan and Will Schuster contributed a detour car to the 1926 parade and spoofed its unreliability. At regular intervals, the tires would blow, the car would collapse until the driver came out and fixed it, and then the tourists could get back in and continue. This may seem like a gentle poke, but this probably 1928 float indicates that there was a more active critique of the Harvey Company then as well, even if it wasn't center stage in 1926. The signs, which are hard to read in the slide, mock a future dominated by the Harvey Company. Year 1950, Santa Harvey, formerly Santa Fe. Or visit the Santo do Harvo Indian Reservation, or just opened Harvey Inn in the former art museum. You might recognize this. This is a common touch point in talking about the 1926 events in Santa Fe. So during this local cultural conflict, Mary Austin and Margaretta Stewart Dietrich opposed an initiative actively courted by Hewett for the Texas Federation of Women's Clubs to build a cultural center in Santa Fe. Elizabeth White wrote complaining to archaeologist Kidder, I do not know whether you've heard of the awful news, but Dr. Hewett and the Federated Women's Clubs are cooking up a scheme to hold a Chautauqua in Santa Fe every summer. Do write to Dr. Hewett as if you feel as we do that old Santa Fe would vanish before this swarm of locusts. The project's goal was to draw outsiders, particularly well-to-do, respectable white women, to Santa Fe for cultural tourism, but the creative community, and especially its white women, opposed it in ways that were simultaneously sophisticated, confusing, and patronizing. Flannery Burke's article in Artist's Home points out how quite similar were the interests and backgrounds of the newcomer artists and the white club women they were opposing. On the other hand, the position taken by Hewett was also sophisticated, confusing, and patronizing. He wrote to Paul A.F. Walter, I have no doubt that the whole thing has been much magnified in the minds of our people because of the smallness of the community. We have 3 or 4 rows of this kind going on constantly in San Diego, and I suppose every other city, and nothing is thought of it. I'm going to ask again, at stake in such a public to-do, whether it's in San Diego or Santa Fe, are questions like, how should you present history? How should you honor culture? How should you involve community? What makes a place special? Who decides? Hewett's attitude and that of civic leaders of the time, that they know best and they will proceed however they like, working with private interests that support their plan, is an attitude that was not and is not uncommon. So the image on this slide has been in the photo archives a long time, but we recently received and digitized a significant portion of the Bauman collection. And while I was working on the Zozobra exhibit, archivist Alice was working with the photos in the Bauman collection. And if you didn't know, Zozobra also came out of the same collaborations and brainstorming sessions that created the Pasatiempo Parade. So I was delighted to see that the Baumans kept additional images of the Cultural Center protest floats. I did not previously know and had not seen that the group staged not one but 3 vehicles devoted to the Cultural Center protest. Bauman had selected this one of them to include in his painting. So what attracted my attention is this banner behind them. And you can see it better here. Someone in costume, I think it might be Dorothy Stewart or Kate Chapman, but I haven't been able to verify. They caught my attention because of its depiction of Edgar Lee Hewett there on the banner. And it shows exactly how Hewett was seen and represented by the group who staged this parade. You can see him dressed like this in the photo that Alicia used. He's posed in the 1925 fiesta between Jose Sena, who helped organize Pasatiempo in 1924 and 1926, and Oscar Naughton left, a Mohawk performer who Hewett brought to town to perform. So just take note of him right here. I'm not going to show him again, but he'll come back up. I'm not the only one who sees a connection between Hewett and Old Man Gloom. Nancy Owen Lewis also hinted that early Zozobras were perhaps constructed deliberately to resemble a stodgy, stubborn Hewett. I haven't turned up any textual evidence. As with all good art, there are many other resonant figures that likely inspired Zozobra at the same time. So the network of artists, writers, creatives, and influencers who ended up on the other side from Hewett was not a small group of people. The photo taken at John and Dolly Sloan's anniversary party here in 1926 catches some of those involved. Schuster kept a copy of this group portrait. The Baumans also kept a copy of this photo. On the back of the print, Jane carefully labeled the attendees, which included Will Schuster, Witter Binner, and Nina Otero, who, along with Dolly Sloan, who's in the center, were central to creating Pasatiempo. John and Dolly also believed, at least according to Witter Binner, that the fiesta as managed in those days was not dealing fairly with people of the town. But what really started it, I think, is something involving John. So following fiesta events, and I haven't pinned down the year, thinking this is 1923, John Sloan was arrested on the plaza for being too raucous during a street dance. And after Sloan's release from jail, friends and acquaintances held what Will Schuster later called an indignation meeting. So there's Dolly. And this is John Sloan here, as well as at Fiesta. So they met in a storeroom at one of the trading companies, and sitting on stacks of trade blankets, quote, this is Schuster, under a dim pendant light bulb with the focal point a jug of moonshine, he wrote, they conspired to do something. Gustav Bauman was in this brainstorming session. He remembered, I recalled suggesting it might be a good scheme to take the fiesta apart, to see what it consists of, and then adapt it to the needs of the moment. In other words, Pasatiempo is not only a response to events around fiesta. Pasatiempo and its components can be seen as a deconstruction and reinvention of elements of previous fiestas. In 1958, Schuster called it a post-fiesta fiesta. So therefore, the official Pasatiempo Committee of 1924 was born, and it was sanctioned by Hewett. The committee of 1924 was headed by Witter Binner, with support from Dolly Sloan, Spud Johnson, Dana Johnson, Florence Davy, Jose Sena, and Nina Otero Warren. They decided to stage a parade of their own and have large, fun, and free post-fiesta events. Everyone remembers that the brainstorming for 1924 was collaborative. Binner remembered, "We solicited in all directions for the hysterical parade," that name being given to it by, I think, John Sloan as a pun on the historical parade. "We thought up dozens of ideas for floats and participants and dealt them out wherever applicants needed them." So this is the process that also created Zozobra, who appeared in 1924 under the name Old Man Grouch. This early Zozobra was carried by the Bauman's neighbors, possibly originally proposed by Binner, and possibly made, at least in part, by Gus. But 1924 did not end well. According to Binner, this is how it went down. "Dolly Sloan and I had given particular thought and work to ending the celebration with a street dance in front of the Palace of the Governors. For it, we wanted town-wide enlistment. We received invitations to attend, at the very hour of the street dance, a ball, to be held, I believe, at the Old Country Club. Our bitter protest against its being held availed nothing, and though Dolly and I and a few others who might have attended the ball did our damnedest in the street instead, my memory of the Pasatiempo's conclusion is pathetic. Dolly and I refusing to attend the thoughtless defectionists' ball, even late, sat alone together on a curbstone in the deserted plaza, her head against my chest, and I can still feel her tired sobs." That's sad. You can lose a battle, but still win a war, and this, I think, was a contributing event to the war. Another flashpoint in 1926, as Bruce already mentioned, was the focus on bringing in outside performers that Hewett perceived as superior to local entertainment. So this is the outdoor theater, Indian theater for events. And as Alicia already mentioned, Lydia Trowbridge's essay in El Palacio, where she talks about what is a fiesta for the home folks, is an indirect and probably Hewitt-selected essay to support his position that a professional performance of outsiders is better than what the locals could possibly provide. One of the performers that Hewett regularly tapped was Florence Evans, a performer of mixed descent and enrolled member of Muskogee Creek Nation, who used this stage name Chanina Redfeather. This is her performing in the Fiesta Theater in 1926. In these years, she was touring in Denver and LA and promoting the Indianist opera, where she played the title role, Robin Woman. Here's the lyrics to her signature song. I'm not going to get into interpreting them here, but my take on it is kind of ish. I steal to her lodge at dawning. I woo her with my flute. She is sick for the sky blue water. The captive maid is mute. This is her with the composer, Cadman. She's an interesting and complex figure, definitely worth talking about more. If you haven't encountered her before, Hewett asked her to donate her skull to the museums. She later became a long-serving board member of SAR. Due to her association with Hewitt's ambitions and distance from the local culture, Chanina and Oscar Naughton were subject to spoofing in the 1926 parade. So Jane Bauman herself, a trained performer, sung Land of the Sky Blue Water in this float. Chanina had also been featured in one of Hewitt's banner floats, which Bruce also already brought up, from the 1921 Fiesta. And you can see her in the front there on the left, and also the Martinezes behind them. This was, at the time, claimed to be the most handsomest Fiesta float, as well as prehistorically accurate. While there's no written evidence, I also believe that this less frequently discussed Mayan float of 1926 is an indirect setup of the earlier Hewett Fiesta float. The closest one might get to evidence for this, other than it's just construction and configuration, is an announcement in the September 8th issue of the Santa Fe New Mexican that year that it had won the prize for the most beautiful entry in the hysterical pageant. As you can see, a lot of the interventions in Pasatiempo are inside jokes and jabs, and close enough to hit Hewett. Some of them seem personal. The Mayan float and Sylvanus Morley's participation in writing on it would definitely have been seen as taking sides. The obvious and immediate point of reference is the dedication of the White Sisters Pool in July 1926 here on site. This is kind of a locally famous event where Widder-Binner, again, recited an ode before 2 virgins were sacrificed for the pool. Those virgins were not the White Sisters themselves. They were these 2 women. Why re-celebrate this event, pool commemoration, in public, though? Someone speculated maybe it was a symptom of the 1920s craze for all things Mayan. But I don't know that I think that. But what do I think? I haven't found the evidence for. The Whites visited Morley in the Yucatan, perhaps in 1926 and or in 1927, but they had also been there before. While preparing for the Hewett digitization project, I identified a previously overlooked photo album. The only clue was this little sticker you can see on the bottom left that covered Amelia Elizabeth White's 1914 trip to Guatemala. She traveled with Alice Jackson and Percy Jackson, as well as Herbert Spinden, another contributor to the Mayan float. The album shows that while there, they had met up not only with Morley, but also with Hewett. And you can see Hewett on the bottom right. This particular story and send-up isn't one where I have connected all the dots. Let me know if you know anyone who has some ideas. The previous year, 1913, the Jacksons had brought Elizabeth White to Santa Fe and introduced her around. She wrote in her journal, "Met by deputation of archaeologists. Mr. Hodge seems the nicest, Mr. Lummis a horror." And the next day, met the wonderful Mr. Nussbaum, after which they went on an archaeological site trip, and she remembered it as a banner birthday event. The previous speaker in the series, James Sneed, talked about women in archaeology that had no path and were given no path to participate professionally. Perhaps Elizabeth White was one of these women. Some of the criticisms of the women involved in the Santa Fe culture wars of 1926 makes them seem narrow and provincial, but Elizabeth White definitely was not. So like I said, you can lose a battle, but still win a war. After this, Hewett retreated from Santa Fe. He took the losing side of many upcoming local cultural battles over the Indian Arts Fund, the Wheelwright Museum, the Laboratory of Anthropology, and the Whites, especially through direct gifts, ended up on the winning side. The Pasatiempo events were successful enough that businesses and other supporters threatened to divert their personal and financial support from Fiesta to a separate Pasatiempo event. The riotous hysterical parade joined the officious historical parade. Widder-Binner and Dolly Sloan continued to collaborate. Like, this is their gin rickshaw, which is a prohibition joke. This gig ended when Widder-Binner dropped Dolly over backwards. And they continued to lead the parades, Fiesta parades, together for another decade. And the hysterical parades are fondly remembered as an important and unique part of Santa Fe's culture. Likewise, Zozobra became integrated into Fiesta. Bauman, Schuster, and others continued to apply the lessons they learned in spectacle, culture, collaboration, and community to new projects. I didn't cover everything in this presentation that I could have, I could go on for probably another hour about these floats because they're so weird. Stage bullfights were significant in 1926. As Heather mentioned, Hewett was known as El Toro. he died in 1946. I mean, like, are they just they're like, here's a red flag for you. Is that what they're doing? I don't know. Hewitt died in 1946, but in 1952, Schuster created El Toro Diablo, which is the Santa Fe rodeo mascot. It's another fiery celebration of local culture. And the above left is John Sloan's own picture of it. There's nothing surprising about a bull as a rodeo mascot, but a part of me wonders, is this still an ongoing joke? And while I've highlighted many positive aspects of the artist community's intervention as they roasted Hewitt, I will note that if you look at the other floats, I want to acknowledge that one. I don't understand all of them. There's a lot to unpack. And there are also some troublesome stuff in there. Words, costumes, ideas in the parades and in the pictures. Some are mean-spirited, others are bigoted. They have red face and black face. I'm not sure all that the Pasatiempo attempts to spoof and entertain met what even their creators thought were the needs of the moment. I know they don't meet ours, but at stake in the Pasatiempo parade are many questions that the events pose and whose answers remain unresolved. How should you present history? How should you honor culture? How should you involve community? What makes a place special? And who decides? Thank you.
We have a little bit of time. We're supposed to hard stop 5:30. So we have a little bit of time. Questions? Or I'll just make all the connections between the three people tonight. There's so many wonderful collections. Rose Dugan's name was on one of those. First person to fly over Santa Fe. Jesse Nussbaum, first person with a motorbike. He loved to terrorize the horses. Questions for the speakers? They covered a lot. Come on. Don't be afraid of all that information from Anna. She's really approachable. Yes. Oh.
I just want to say, I think Edgar Hewitt had an incredible vision. I think he had an incredible vision for Santa Fe. Whether he got it all right, I think it's easy to judge and look back at history with the eyes and the knowledge that we have now. But I still think it was one of those, if we build it, they will come. Santa Fe wouldn't be Santa Fe without what he was able to do.
I'll totally agree with you. The difficulty is we're still living in Hewitt's vision. Those controversies are still here. And the differences between the institutions, the way things are done. You want to add anything to that? I covered it just with that. You're going to give me... Anybody else? That's okay, fine. Anybody else? No? Oh, we do. Oh, that's good. Good to add to it.
I'll just take up that idea that we're still living in this cultural contestation that Hewitt created. I don't think any of it is over. Not the tricultural myth, not how we celebrate fiesta, not the role of Nuevo Mexicano history.
Well, just thinking of, I'm not from Santa Fe. I didn't grow up in Santa Fe. We would pass through Santa Fe on the way to Española. That's where my family's from. Way before 599 was built, and so we would just drive through St. Francis. But when I think about the impact, and maybe the connection could be made to the fiestas in Española, right, where my grandparents did participate in that pageantry, and playing the role of Oñate, for example, right, playing the role of some of these colonial figures as super violent and complicated as they were, but we are instructed to take that in as a moment, a marker of pride. So where the El Palacio letter writer, Hewitt, maybe ghostwriter, the home folk, I feel like with some of this intentional celebration of a very specific vein of New Mexico history, a very specific interpretation is one way for the home folk to be transitioned into that gente decente. Right, so this is how we do it. We do it through this public performance. We do it through the articulation of very specifically chosen song and dance and a very specifically crafted historical narrative so that we can abandon some of the other sullied parts of our history and remake ourselves into something that is worthy to some perspective of being celebrated.
Great choice of words, crafted history. Overly simple, the point is it's so simplified that adding the complexity to it, which is really about people, is complicated still in the museum system. Not as much under school any longer, except the complication that Amelia White ends up with the school, which is a whole other aspect, another time. Quite other questions, anybody else? Oh.
I'm, horribly uninformed, but was there a connection between Hewett and John Ghanem at all? It seems to me they both had some kind of...
Meme is, doesn't come in, I'm struggling for the date in which he starts, but he takes up the Santa Fe style. That style is what the palace was about. There was actually a few other buildings. The Art Museum was built as a building at the San Diego Exposition, opened in 1915. And you walk into that building, it's like a ghost. It's a reverse slightly from the Art Museum, but it's the same building. So but that was the Rapp brothers out of Colorado who did those first buildings. And Meme in the mid-20s, early 30s, so he started then taking up this style. The downtown was all 1880s manufactured storefronts, a lot of metal storefronts and stuff that had come here for Americanization. And the rule then became about portals over the plaza, right? So that's partly Meme's instrumentation of a Santa Fe style. That's the way to put it. You can look above all the portals and see the more American style buildings that are still there. They didn't do anything about that. But they certainly have a relationship, and none of us are prepared to talk about it, obviously. Anyone else? Questions? Comments? Clarification? We really thank you for coming very, very much. We have another talk on March 21st, I think it is, or 22nd, another Tuesday, and that'll be Joseph Woody Aguilar. He is a PhD archaeologist from the Pueblo of San Ildefonso. He has worked his entire life on the Pajarito Plateau, giving a shadow over Hewett instead of Hewett shadowing over him, right? But he has tried, and his work is about correcting Hewett and the types of things that Hewett has talked about and done on the Pajarito and somewhat to his community as well. The sort of the artistic side, Maria and Julian and so forth. So I hope you'll come to that. And then we have the final talk on April 21st. I think that's Bruce Bernstein that's supposed to talk and sum all this up. I'm just going to take all the images from tonight and just add things. They were such a good talk. Thank you so much, you both.